The Great Hall of Nexus Prime had never seen such chaos in its 10,000-year history, and Ambassador Velthari of the Aquilan Federation stood at the center podium, trying to make sense of what could not be understood while 847 different species shouted in languages that turned the air itself into a storm of confusion and fear. 3 months had passed since the humans vanished, and still nobody could explain how an entire species could disappear from the galaxy, without leaving even a whisper of warning or a single trace of where they had gone, and the emergency session that should have been called immediately had taken this long to organize because nobody wanted to admit that something this impossible had actually happened. Council Archivist Brocktar stepped forward with his crystalline datapad glowing with information that made no sense, no matter how many times he read it, and his voice carried across the hall with the weight of absolute certainty about facts that seemed absolutely impossible. Every human colony, from the outer rim to the core worlds, had been abandoned within 72 hours, and not abandoned in panic or fear, but abandoned with the kind of careful planning that suggested they had known exactly what they were doing and when they were going to do it, and the precision of their departure was almost more frightening than the departure itself. The mining stations orbiting the dead worlds of the Kepler system sat empty, with their fusion reactors still humming and their life support system still running as if the workers had simply stepped out for a moment and would be back any minute, except that their personal belongings were gone, and their computers had been wiped clean, and even the coffee in the break rooms had been poured down the drains. Trade Minister Zephlon of the Merchant Consortium had numbers that painted a picture of economic disaster spreading across the galaxy like a plague, and his tentacles writhed with anxiety as he explained how human-designed technologies were failing everywhere at once as their quantum encryption keys expired and their maintenance protocols locked out anyone who was not human. The medical stations that had relied on human pharmaceutical synthesis were watching their drug supplies dwindle to nothing, and the doctors who had learned to depend on human medical knowledge found themselves unable to treat diseases that had been curable just months before, and already 3 colonies had reported outbreaks of illnesses that should have been simple to handle. Agricultural worlds that had been transformed by human terraforming techniques were seeing their crops fail as the delicate environmental balance that humans had created began to collapse without the constant adjustments that only human scientists had known how to make, and food shortages were being reported across 17 different star systems. Commander Dexara of the Hegemony Defense Force brought news that was even worse than the economic collapse, and her forearms gestured frantically as she described how human tactical advisors who had been embedded with Allied fleets for decades had simply walked off their ships in the middle of active campaigns against the devouring swarm. The humans had not abandoned their posts during peaceful times, but had left during actual combat operations when their absence would cause maximum disruption to defense plans that had been built around their expertise and their unique ability to think 3 steps ahead of any enemy, and without them, the Alliance fleets were stumbling around like blind children in a maze. The devouring swarm had already taken advantage of the confusion to overrun 4 outer colonies, and their bioships were pressing deeper into civilized space every day, while the Alliance commanders tried to figure out how to fight an enemy that the humans had been keeping at bay for years with strategies that nobody else understood. But the most disturbing revelation came from Council historian Nick Zala, who had been digging through the sealed archives and had discovered that humanity had been planning this exodus for over 2 years and had been systematically withdrawing their most advanced technologies and personnel while maintaining the appearance of normal cooperation. The evidence was there in shipping records that nobody had thought to examine and personnel transfers that had seemed routine at the time, and research projects that had been quietly shut down with explanations that made sense until you looked at them all together and realized they formed a pattern of deliberate withdrawal. Human scientists had been recalling their most sensitive research data months before the departure, and human engineers had been transferring critical technical specifications to secure servers that were now inaccessible, and human military advisors had been gradually reducing their involvement in long-term strategic planning while claiming they were simply reorganizing their command structure. The realization that humanity had been preparing to leave while continuing to smile and shake hands and attend council meetings was almost worse than their actual departure, because it meant they had been lying to everyone for years and had been planning to abandon their allies, while those allies trusted them and depended on them and believed they were working together for the common good. Velthari banged her crystalline gavel repeatedly, but the noise in the hall only grew louder as representatives began to understand the full scope of what had happened and what it meant for their own species and their own worlds and their own futures in a galaxy that suddenly seemed much larger and more dangerous without humanity in it. The Kexani delegate was shouting about the medical facilities on his homeworld that would have to shut down within weeks, and the Morvac representative was demanding to know how her species was supposed to defend their borders without human tactical support, and the Zilthar ambassador was calculating how many of his people would starve when the human-designed agricultural systems failed through it all. The empty seats where the human delegation used to sit seemed to mock everyone in the hall and served as a reminder that an entire species had decided that the galactic community was not worth staying for and had chosen to vanish into the unknown, rather than continue to be part of something that they had helped to build and maintain for centuries. The questions that nobody wanted to ask hung in the air like poison gas, and the answers that nobody wanted to hear echoed in the silence between. The shouts and accusations and desperate attempts to find someone to blame for a situation that was already spiraling beyond anyone's ability to control. How could they find the humans when humanity had obviously planned their departure to be impossible to follow, and how could they convince them to return when they had left so deliberately? And how could the galaxy survive without the species that had somehow become essential to everything that mattered without anyone realizing it was happening? Emergency session continued for 18 hours and accomplished nothing except to confirm that the humans were gone and that nobody knew where they had gone or how to bring them back, and that the galaxy was about to discover just how much it had depended on the species that everyone had taken for granted. Ambassador Kale of Earth sat in his office aboard Nexus Station 2 years before the Great Departure and stared at the reports that crossed his desk every day, and each one told the same story of his people being used and discarded and treated like servants rather than partners in the great galactic community that they had helped to build. The latest incident involved the Velkari Syndicate, who had borrowed human agricultural innovations to solve their food crisis and had promised fair trade agreements in return, but now claimed that human crops were naturally occurring and could not be patented, and refused to honor any of the contracts they had signed when they needed human help. Kale had spent 3 months in negotiations with Velkari trade officials who smiled and nodded and spoke of friendship while systematically stealing every agricultural technique that humanity had developed over centuries of terraforming dead worlds and making them bloom with life. And when the crisis was over, the Velkari simply declared that they owed humanity nothing. The Thexani Empire had conscripted human engineers to repair their failing infrastructure and had promised them full citizenship and generous compensation for their expertise, but when the work was finished, the humans found themselves classified as temporary workers with no legal rights and no way to collect the payments they had been promised. Dr. Mina, who headed the Human Medical Corps, kept detailed records of every incident where human doctors and researchers had saved millions of lives, only to be expelled or ignored when the crisis passed, and her files painted a picture of systematic exploitation that had been going on for decades. The Kordani plague outbreak had killed 30 million people before human doctors arrived with treatments that their own medical experts had said were impossible, and Dr. Mina had watched human medical teams work around the clock for months to develop a cure that saved an entire species from extinction. But when the plague was finally defeated, the Kordani government decided that humans were biologically incompatible with their society and expelled every human doctor and researcher from their space while keeping all the medical knowledge and treatments that those same humans had developed. The Zilthar genetic disorder crisis had been even worse, because human researchers had shared breakthrough treatments freely and had trained Zilthar doctors in the new techniques and had even helped set up production facilities for the life-saving drugs, only to watch Zilthar corporations patent everything and claim that humans had merely assisted in discoveries that Zilthar scientists had made. Captain Tay commanded a fleet of human vessels that consistently outperformed every other ship in joint military exercises, and his tactical innovations had been adopted by Alliance forces across the galaxy, but during strategy meetings his suggestions were dismissed as lacking the necessary perspective for galactic warfare despite his superior combat record. The irony was not lost on Tay that Alliance commanders would use his tactics in battle, while refusing to admit that those tactics came from human strategic thinking, and would implement his recommendations, while claiming they had developed the ideas themselves and would rely on human ships to win their battles, while insisting that humans were not ready for real responsibility. Behind the scenes where the galactic media could not see human colony, administrators were quietly implementing something called Project Homeward, and the scope of the operation was breathtaking in its ambition and terrifying in its implications for what it meant about human intentions. Entire research facilities were being disassembled piece by piece and shipped to coordinates that did not appear on any galactic navigation charts, and skilled workers were being reassigned to classified projects that seemed to exist nowhere in known space, and defensive systems that had protected allied worlds for decades were being gradually powered down. The most telling moment came during what would be the final council session that humanity attended, when Councillor Bion formally requested that humans be given a permanent seat on the executive committee and cited centuries of human contributions to galactic science and medicine and defense and agriculture. The request was denied by a vote of 421 to 1, with the single supporting vote coming from the human delegation itself, and the official reasoning stated that humanity had yet to prove their long-term commitment to galactic civilization, despite the fact that humans had been part of that civilization for over 300 years. Kale remembered the moment when Bion received the news of the vote, and the expression on his face was not anger or disappointment, but something much worse that looked like relief mixed with sadness, as if he had been hoping to be wrong about something and had just been proven right. The pattern became clear to anyone who bothered to look, and Kale began to understand that his people were not being treated as junior partners who might someday earn respect, but as a useful resource that could be exploited indefinitely without any need to offer genuine equality or recognition. Human innovations would be stolen and rebranded, and human expertise would be used and then dismissed, and human lives would be spent to solve other species' problems, while humanity itself remained forever on the outside of the power structures they had helped to create and maintain. The shipping records that Council historian Nix Ella would later discover told the story of a species preparing for something that nobody else could imagine, and the scale of the preparation suggested that humans had been planning not just to leave but to disappear so completely that they could never be found or followed. Advanced manufacturing equipment was being relocated to unknown destinations, and raw materials were being stockpiled in quantities that suggested major construction projects and human scientists were transferring critical research data to secure networks that existed outside of galactic communication systems. Dr. Mina implemented new medical protocols that seemed designed to make human medical knowledge inaccessible to other species, and Captain Tay began rotating his best officers out of Alliance positions and replacing them with humans who had been trained to maintain appearances while contributing nothing of real value. The most disturbing aspect of Project Homeward was how smoothly it operated and how completely it fooled everyone who should have been paying attention, and the fact that humans could plan and execute such a massive operation while maintaining normal diplomatic relations suggested capabilities that nobody had suspected. Ambassador Kale continued to attend council sessions and trade negotiations and cultural exchanges while knowing that his people were preparing to abandon everything they had built in galactic space, and the weight of that knowledge made every smile and handshake feel like a betrayal, even though he knew the betrayal had started long before. The final piece of the puzzle came when Kale received sealed orders from the Human Colonial Authority that contained a simple message stating that Phase 1 of Project Homeward had been completed, and that Phase 2 would begin immediately, and that all human personnel should prepare for final departure within 18 months. The orders included detailed evacuation plans for every human facility in known space and protocols for destroying or removing anything that could be useful to other species, and instructions for maintaining normal operations until the very last moment to avoid suspicion. Reading those orders, Kale finally understood that his people had not given up on galactic civilization because they were angry or frustrated, but because they had concluded that genuine cooperation was impossible, and that humanity would always be seen as servants rather than equals, no matter what they contributed or how long they waited. The decision to leave had not been made in anger, but in sorrow, and the careful planning and precise execution of their departure was not meant as an insult, but as a gift that would allow other species to discover what they had lost without having to watch humanity suffer through any more humiliation, as Kale began to implement his part of the departure plan. He wondered if the galactic community would ever understand what they had thrown away and whether they would learn anything from humanity's absence, or if they would simply find new ways to exploit whatever species they designated as their next set of useful servants. High Admiral Velthak commanded the largest search fleet in galactic history, and 12,000 ships from 200 different species spread across known space in a desperate attempt to find any trace of the missing humans. But what they discovered defied every assumption about how an entire species could simply vanish. The search fleet moved like a plague of metal locusts through systems that had once been home to thriving human colonies, and what they found was not destruction or signs of struggle, but something far more unsettling that spoke of planning and precision that bordered on the supernatural. Every former human settlement had been stripped clean with surgical precision and not just abandoned in the way that colonies were, sometimes evacuated during emergencies, but actively sanitized as if someone had wanted to erase every trace that humans had ever existed. There, Navigation Officer Yuna was one of the few humans who had married into alien society and chosen to remain when her people departed, and she served as a cultural consultant for the search fleet because she understood human thinking in ways that other species could not grasp. Yuna led them to hidden human outposts that did not appear on any official records, and places where humans had established research stations or emergency supply depots or communications relays that were known only to other humans, but every single location was empty and had been empty for years. The discovery that humans had been maintaining secret facilities while pretending to be fully integrated into galactic society was disturbing enough, but the realization that those facilities had been abandoned long before the official departure suggested a level of deception that nobody had suspected. On the abandoned colony world of New Jeju, xenoarchaeologist Dr. Rithtar made a discovery that changed everything they thought they knew about human activities in the years before their departure, and what he found beneath the colony foundations painted a picture of industrial operations that had been hidden. From galactic oversight, massive excavation sites stretched for kilometers underground, and spectral analysis revealed that humans had been conducting extensive mining operations in secret and extracting rare earth elements used in faster-than-light drive construction and not small amounts but industrial-scale extraction that had been ongoing for decades. The scope of the mining operation was staggering and suggested that humans had been preparing to build something massive, and the fact that they had been able to hide such extensive industrial activity while maintaining normal diplomatic relations spoke to capabilities that other species had never imagined. Captain June was a human merchant who had defected to the Krexani Republic years before the departure, and he provided crucial intelligence about human activities that even Yuna did not know about, and his information painted a picture of systematic deception that had been going on for over a century, according to June. Humans had been establishing phantom colonies in systems that galactic navigation charts marked as uninhabitable, and these settlements existed completely outside of official records and had been building infrastructure and conducting research that no other species knew about. The phantom colonies were not small outposts or research stations, but major population centers with millions of inhabitants and advanced manufacturing facilities and defensive systems that could have held off entire invasion fleets, and they had been operating in complete secrecy while official human territory represented less than 30% of their actual presence in the galaxy. The search fleet followed hyperspace trails to the edge of known space where long-range sensors detected massive construction sites that had been abandoned but showed clear signs of human engineering signatures, and the scale of the projects was beyond anything that galactic civilization had ever attempted. These were not colonies or even space stations, but ring-world construction sites that could have housed billions of people, and the engineering required to build such structures was decades ahead of anything that other species possessed, and the fact that humans had been building them in secret suggested planning that stretched back centuries, The construction sites had been abandoned recently enough that some of the automated systems were still running, and the data they contained revealed construction schedules and resource requirements that painted a picture of a civilization preparing for something that nobody else could understand. But the most disturbing discovery came when the search fleet reached the very edge of the galaxy, where space itself began to thin and the last stars faded into the cosmic void, and there, orbiting a dying red giant, they found something that made everyone understand how completely they had been outmaneuvered. A single automated beacon sat in perfect orbit around the ancient star, and it broadcast a message in perfect galactic standard that was updated in real time and responded to incoming communications, but revealed nothing about who had built it or where the humans had gone. The message was simple and devastating and spoke of a species that had reached the end of their patience with galactic civilization and had decided to seek their destiny elsewhere without regard for the consequences their departure might have for those they left behind. Your services are no longer required. The beacon repeated in every galactic language, and the phrase carried the weight of finality that suggested this was not a negotiation or a request for better treatment, but a statement of fact that could not be changed. Do not follow was the second part of the message, and while it was phrased politely, the implications were clear that humanity did not want to be found and had taken measures to ensure that they could not be tracked to wherever they had gone. You will not find us carried a certainty that suggested humans had capabilities and resources that other species had never suspected, and that their departure had been planned with such precision that pursuit would be impossible. But the final line of the message was the most devastating because it revealed how completely other species had misunderstood their relationship with humanity and how blind they had been to what humans actually thought about galactic civilization. You never really knew us was a statement that cut through every assumption about human nature and human motivations and human loyalty to the galactic community, and suggested that everything other species thought they understood about humans had been an illusion. The beacon refused to respond to direct questions and simply repeated its message, while long-range sensors detected no other human technology anywhere in the surrounding space, and the search fleet was left with the realization that they were looking for a species that had become ghosts. High Admiral Velthak ordered the fleet to spread out and search every system within 1,000 light years of the beacon, but they found nothing except more evidence of human activity that had been carefully erased and more signs that humans had been preparing for their departure for much longer than anyone had realized. The search continued for months and covered millions of cubic light years of space, but the humans had vanished as completely as if they had never existed, and the only trace they left behind was the knowledge that galactic civilization had lost something irreplaceable. Navigation Officer Yuna spent her time analyzing the beacon signal and trying to understand the message her former people had left behind, and slowly she began to realize that the humans had not abandoned the galaxy out of anger or frustration, but out of a cold calculation that cooperation was impossible. The precision of their departure and the completeness of their disappearance spoke of a species that had concluded that galactic civilization was not worth saving, and that their own survival required them to start over somewhere else, where they could build something better. The search fleet finally returned to Nexus Station with no answers and no hope of finding the missing humans. The full scope of what had been lost began to sink in, and the beacon continued to broadcast its message to anyone who cared to listen. Your services are no longer required, and the galaxy was beginning to understand just how much those services had been worth and how impossible it would be to replace them and how completely they had been taken for granted until it was too late to matter. The Galactic Council faced its greatest crisis in 10,000 years, and Council Chancellor Grixoth stood before the assembled representatives, knowing that his words would either inspire hope or confirm that galactic civilization was entering its final decline. 1 year had passed since humanity vanished, and the consequences of their absence had spread through every aspect of galactic society like a disease that attacked the very foundations of technological civilization and left behind only the growing realization that nothing worked without human innovation driving it forward. Industrial output had dropped 23% as human-designed manufacturing systems failed and could not be repaired or replaced by engineers who had never understood how they worked in the first place, and entire production lines sat silent while their alien operators stared at control panels that might as well have been written in an unknown language. Medical advancement had virtually stopped, as research facilities that had depended on human knowledge found themselves unable to treat diseases that had been routine to cure just months before, and 3 member species had completely lost faster than light capability as their human maintained. Drive systems failed beyond any hope of repair. The Merchant Consortium reported that 67% of their most profitable trade routes had depended on human infrastructure, and without human relay stations and navigation beacons and refueling. Deposed those routes were becoming too dangerous or too expensive to operate. Dr. Wolven was the galaxy's leading xenobiologist, and his research on human uniqueness painted a picture of a species that had been fundamentally different from every other known form of intelligent life in ways that nobody had understood until it was too late. Humans had evolved as persistence hunters on a death world where survival required the ability to adapt to any environment and solve any problem and think beyond immediate needs to plan for threats that might not materialize for years or decades, and this had given them capabilities that no other species possessed. While other species had specialized in specific areas of knowledge, humans had been generalists who could excel in any field they chose to enter and could see connections between different areas of study that other species missed, and could adapt their thinking to solve problems that had never been encountered before. Intelligence Director Zekron revealed the scope of human espionage capabilities, and the evidence suggested that for decades human cultural exchange students had been gathering information about every aspect of galactic civilization, while their hosts thought they were simply learning about alien cultures. Human trade representatives had been conducting industrial espionage on a massive scale, and tourist groups had been surveying military installations and diplomatic missions, had been mapping communication networks, and the humans had not just been participating in galactic society, but had been studying it and cataloging its weaknesses. The revelation that humanity had been systematically intelligence gathering while maintaining friendly relations was disturbing enough, but the implications were far worse because it suggested that humans had been preparing for something that required detailed knowledge of galactic capabilities and vulnerabilities. The most damning evidence came when Counselor Hana appeared unexpectedly on Nexus Station with a recorded message from the Human Colonial Authority, and her presence proved that humans could move through galactic space undetected whenever they chose to do so. Hana had been thought lost in the Exodus, but her sudden appearance suggested that humans had been monitoring galactic activities since their departure and had been waiting for the right moment to make contact and deliver a message that would change everything. The message from the Human Colonial Authority was delivered in the calm, professional tone that humans used when they were discussing matters of life and death, and the words carried the weight of absolute finality that suggested this would be humanity's last communication with galactic civilization. Humanity had offered partnership and been treated as servants, the message stated, and the simple truth of those words cut through every excuse and rationalization that council members had been using to avoid facing what they had done. They had shared their innovations freely and been exploited, and sought equality and been patronized, and the message cataloged every incident and every insult and every betrayal that had led to humanity's decision to abandon the galaxy. But the message included an offer that nobody had expected, and the terms were both generous and terrifying, because they revealed that humanity still possessed capabilities that could save galactic civilization if the Council could prove they had learned from their mistakes. 3 test scenarios would be provided, and if the Council could solve them without human assistance, then humanity would consider re-establishing limited contact. But if the tests were failed, then this would be their final communication. The scenarios were released simultaneously across Council space, and each one required exactly the kind of innovative thinking and cross-species cooperation that humans had been trying to promote for centuries. A plague affecting multiple species with no known cure had appeared in the Outer Rim territories and was spreading faster than any known disease, and conventional medical responses had proven completely ineffective. A region of space where faster-than-light travel had become impossible was expanding and cutting off star systems from galactic commerce, and the phenomenon seemed to be artificial, but no Council species could understand how it worked or how to stop it. An invasion fleet of unknown aliens was approaching from outside the galaxy, and their technology was completely different from anything in Council databases, and their intentions were unclear, but their approach vector suggested they were targeting major population centers. Every scenario required the kind of thinking that humans had excelled at, and the cooperation between species that humans had always tried to facilitate, and the Council had 6 months to demonstrate that they could work together effectively without human guidance. The response was a disaster from the beginning, as research committees spent weeks arguing over resource allocation while people died, and military planning sessions devolved into political disputes about which species would lead the defense efforts. The plague continued to spread as medical researchers competed for credit, rather than sharing information, and the faster-than-light dead zone expanded, while scientists refused to cooperate with colleagues from rival species, and the invasion fleet drew closer, while military commanders argued about strategy council chancellor. Grixoth watched the proceedings with growing horror as he realized that galactic civilization was incapable of the basic cooperation required for survival, and that humanity had been the glue that held everything together without anyone understanding their role. The bureaucratic inefficiency and interspecies politics that had always plagued Council operations were revealed as fatal flaws when faced with real crises that required immediate action and unified responses, and the same attitudes that had driven humanity away were now preventing effective solutions to existential threats. 3 months into the test period, it became clear that the Council was failing spectacularly, and the plague had killed millions while researchers continued to argue about methodology, and the dead zone had cut off 12 star systems, while scientists pursued individual glory rather than collective solutions. The approaching invasion fleet remained a complete mystery, as no Council species could comprehend their technology or predict their intentions, and military planning had stalled as commanders insisted on maintaining separate command structures rather than accepting unified leadership. Dr. Song emerged from hiding where she had been observing the Council's response to the tests, and her analysis was brutal and comprehensive and painted a picture of a galactic civilization that had learned nothing from humanity's departure. The Council had approached each scenario with the same bureaucratic inefficiency and political competition that had characterized their response to every crisis, and had demonstrated that they were incapable of the innovation and cooperation required for survival. But Song's real revelation was far more shocking than a simple report on Council incompetence, and what she had to say would change everything that galactic civilization thought it knew about humanity's departure and the threats that were approaching. Dr. Song stood before the Emergency Council session 18 months after humanity's departure, and her words would shatter every assumption that galactic civilization had made about why humans had left and what their departure really meant for the future of all intelligent life in the galaxy. The test results were a complete disaster, and Song's analysis spared no feelings as she detailed exactly how the Council had failed to demonstrate even basic competence when faced with real threats that required immediate action and unified response. The plague had killed 37 million people before researchers finally developed a partial treatment that required constant maintenance and did not actually cure the disease, and the solution they found was essentially a way to manage symptoms rather than eliminate the threat. The faster-than-light dead zone had expanded to encompass 42 star systems and cut them off completely from galactic commerce, while scientists argued about theoretical approaches rather than working together to find practical solutions. The approaching invasion fleet remained a complete mystery, and Council military forces had developed no coherent strategy for dealing with technology they could not understand or enemies whose intentions remained unclear. But Song's real revelation was that the 3 test scenarios had not been hypothetical future threats designed to test Council capabilities, but real situations that humanity had already solved. In their hidden territories beyond the edge of known space, the plague had been engineered by the approaching invasion fleet as a biological weapon designed to weaken galactic defenses before the main attack, and humanity had developed a complete cure within weeks of encountering it in their own space. The faster-than-light dead zones were weapons designed to isolate and conquer star systems by cutting them off from reinforcements, and humanity had not only figured out how to neutralize them, but had learned to create them as defensive barriers. The unknown aliens were the advanced scouts of something that humanity called the Devourers, and they consumed not just matter and energy but information itself, and could erase entire civilizations. from existence without leaving any trace that they had ever existed. Song revealed intercepted human communications that painted a picture of a species that had been preparing for this threat for over 2 centuries and had tried desperately to warn the Council about what was coming while building the infrastructure necessary for galactic defense. Humanity had not abandoned the galaxy out of petty resentment or wounded pride, but because they had realized that galactic politics would prevent the kind of preparation necessary for survival, and had chosen to ensure their own survival while building defenses for everyone else. The ring-world construction sites that the search fleet had discovered were not habitats, but massive weapons platforms, designed to fight enemies that operated on a galactic scale, and the Phantom colonies were not hidden settlements, but forward operating bases positioned to defend against invasion routes. The precision of humanity's departure had not been motivated by anger, but by the cold calculation that they needed to be free of council oversight and bureaucracy to build the defenses that would be needed when the Devourers finally arrived. Everything that other species had interpreted as betrayal or abandonment had actually been humanity's attempt to save galactic civilization from a threat that the council would never have believed until it was too late to prepare for it. The final transmission from the human colonial authority arrived as Song finished her presentation, and it was broadcast simultaneously to every inhabited world in the galaxy, with the kind of technological precision that demonstrated capabilities far beyond anything the Council possessed. Fleet Admiral Day spoke from the bridge of a vessel unlike anything in galactic databases, and the ship behind him stretched beyond the edges of the transmission screen and suggested construction on a scale that dwarfed anything that galactic civilization had ever attempted. Citizens of the galaxy, he began, and his voice carried the weight of absolute authority as he explained what was about to happen and why humanity had been forced to prepare for it alone. In approximately 18 months, your space will be invaded by entities that consume not just matter and energy, but information itself, and they erase entire civilizations from existence without leaving any trace that those civilizations ever existed. Humanity had spent decades trying to warn the Council and trying to prepare them and trying to build the unity necessary for survival, but had been met with bureaucracy and politics and the kind of thinking that put short-term interests ahead of species survival. The Devourers had already consumed 17 galaxies, and were moving toward this one with the kind of methodical precision that suggested they had been doing this for millions of years and knew exactly how to break down any defense that conventional thinking could devise. Humanity had not abandoned the galaxy out of spite, but had prepared defenses that the Council could not imagine, and weapons that they would not approve, and strategies that they would never understand, because those strategies required thinking beyond the political limitations that paralyzed galactic decision-making. The transmission showed long-range scanner data of the approaching Devourer fleet, and the images revealed ships the size of moons moving at impossible speeds toward Council space, and their formations suggested intelligence and purpose that made them far more dangerous than any conventional enemy. Between the Devourers and the galaxy stood a single line of human vessels outnumbered 1,000 to 1, but moving to intercept with a kind of calm determination that suggested they knew exactly what they were doing and had been preparing for this moment for centuries. Admiral Day's final words carried the weight of judgment and finality as he explained what humanity had learned about galactic civilization and why they had chosen to work alone rather than continue to try to save people who would not save themselves. Humanity had offered partnership and been given servitude, and had sought cooperation and found exploitation, and had warned of danger and been ignored. And everything that happened next was the result of choices that the Council had made. No warning, no farewell, and now perhaps understanding comes too late, were the last words of the transmission before it ended with scanner data, showing the Devourer fleet and the impossible odds that humanity was preparing to face alone. The Council chambers fell silent as the representatives finally understood what humanity had been trying to tell them for decades, and realized that they had rejected the only species capable of defending them from a threat that would erase them from existence. The irony was not lost on anyone that humanity had been treated as subordinates and servants when they had actually been protectors and guardians who had been working to save everyone while being dismissed and exploited and ignored. Some council members called for immediate mobilization to support the human fleet, but the military advisors explained that it would take months to organize any kind of response, and that council forces would be completely outmatched by enemies that human intelligence had been studying for centuries. Others suggested trying to negotiate with the Devourers, but the information that Song had provided made it clear that these entities did not negotiate or communicate, but simply consumed everything in their path with the kind of efficiency that suggested they were driven by purposes beyond mortal understanding. The final realization came when Dr. Wolven calculated the odds of human victory against the approaching fleet and concluded that even with their advanced technology and superior strategy, the chances of stopping the Devourers were less than 3%. Humanity was about to sacrifice itself to defend a galaxy that had rejected them, and the people they were dying to protect would never have the chance to apologize or make amends, or even thank them for their sacrifice. The last images from the transmission showed human ships accelerating toward an enemy fleet that stretched across light years of space, and the knowledge that those ships carried the hopes and dreams and survival of everyone in the galaxy, while being crewed by a species that had been driven away by petty politics and wounded Pride Council Chancellor Grixoth adjourned the session with the understanding that there was nothing left to do but wait and hope that humanity could accomplish the impossible one more time and save the galaxy that had never deserved their protection. The beacon at the edge of space continued to broadcast its message about services no longer being required, while human ships moved to face an enemy that would determine whether galactic civilization would survive, or join the 17 other galaxies that had been erased from existence. No warning, no farewell, and the Council finally understood that they had lost not just allies or partners, but the only species capable of thinking beyond conventional limitations and preparing for threats that others could not imagine.